Okay, hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and be able to summarize some of the results coming out of work package 2 of the Safer Prepared project. My name is Max Werner. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bristol, but I'm really presenting the results here of a large collaboration of people. And I'd like to highlight in particular Jack Williams and Joanna Holmgren, who were the lead postdocs on this work package, as well as our collaborators Hassan, Felix, Patrick, and Suze that Luca has already mentioned in this presentation. So work package 2 was really about linking the geological and geodetic information that work package 1 came up with, and using that information to provide a new seismic hazard assessment for Malawi that specifically accounts for the geological fault information that we've uncovered in work package 1. So again, our objective was to provide a new probabilistic seismic hazard assessment for Malawi on the basis of the new geological and geodetic information obtained in work package 1. And I'm listing here some of the key outputs from work package 2, which is firstly the Malawi seismogenic source database that contains information about the earthquakes, their frequencies and magnitudes that we expect or that we forecast to happen in Malawi. And I'd like to draw your attention to open access preprints here that are currently in review for a journal, as well as a freely available data set on Zenodo concerning the seismogenic source database. A second output is this probabilistic seismic hazard assessment. The manuscript there is in draft and will be submitted shortly to Natural Hazards. Again, will be made open access, as well as the seismic hazard model itself. The results will be released on Zenodo, again, as part of an open access agreement. And thirdly, we're in the process of gathering data to evaluate global ground motion models in the context of the East African Rift. As has been said a number of times already in this webinar, the data availability for earthquake ground motions is relatively scarce. And so we're taking a new look at the available data and doing some basic comparisons of available ground motion models with these available data. And that's work that's in progress. So Luke has already talked about the Malawi active fault database. And this figure on the left here shows the traces of these active faults, and the manuscript that details all of that information is currently in review in G-Cubed. But we needed to take this information and combine it with other information in order to estimate the magnitudes and frequencies of earthquakes that might happen on these faults. And as Luke has already said, we used a systems-based approach that entailed using geodetic data to estimate the slip rates on these faults. And then we used earthquake and fault scaling relationships along with earthquake magnitude frequency distributions to estimate the magnitudes of earthquakes as well as their recurrence intervals on these faults. I won't have time to go through all the details of these calculations, but in summary, we found that the slip rates on these faults are low, somewhere between 0.05 to 2 millimeters per year, which is relatively slow. However, the existence of long faults that are larger than 100 kilometers imply the possible occurrence of large magnitude earthquakes. And by large here, I mean larger than magnitude 7.5. But we do estimate that these large earthquakes are relatively rare. And Luke provided some recurrence interval estimates, and here's another one. We think that these have recurrences of somewhere between 1,000 and 20,000 years. So the uncertainties are quite large. But what's clear is that with these kinds of recurrence intervals, the current instrumental seismic catalog that we have for Malawi, which exists for about 50 to maybe 100 years, is clearly too short to characterize the long-term seismic hazard in a region, in this region. And so therefore we need fault geological information as well as geodetic information to try and make up for that lack of data. Our PSHA workflow is outlined here. We use the Malawi seismogenic source database and estimate earthquake magnitudes and their frequencies according to sort of a few different interpretations, which have to do with assumptions about how characteristic earthquakes are on these faults and how deep the faults go and remain seismogenic in the relatively thick seismogenic crust in Malawi. We also account for earthquakes that might happen off these mapped faults for a number of reasons. A is that we know that not all active faults will have been mapped by this approach. And secondly, active faults might not reach the surface, and so they might be intrinsically unmappable. And so for that, we rely on an aerial source approach, which we've taken from the Poggi et al. Study that Victor Silva alluded to in his presentation, which is the source model that GEM used for their seismic assessment in the region. And using these different approaches, we generate long stochastic earthquake catalogs. And from these earthquake catalogs, we combine them with ground motion models to estimate the seismic hazard in Malawi. And some of the outputs that we've produced are seismic hazard maps and seismic hazard curves, as well as hazard spectra and a deaggregation analysis. I just like to point out before I show you the maps that the use of this logic tree allows us to estimate some of the uncertainty in our seismic hazard analysis. So for instance, here I'm showing the hazard curves that result from different interpretations of how earthquakes might occur on the seismogenic source database. And you can see here that there's a little bit of a spread here in terms of the probability of exceeding a certain peak ground acceleration. And here we've done this for Lilongwe, Blantyre, and Mzuzu. And so we can look at some of the uncertainty around our seismic hazard estimates on the basis of our approach. Here are some of our results. I'll start perhaps here at the bottom row. So these are seismic hazard spectra for Lilongwe, Blantyre, and Mzuzu for 2% probability of exceedance in 50 years, as well as 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years. And the different colors here represent the different contributions that the earthquakes on faults make, as well as the earthquakes in the background, so in between the faults make. So green represents, for instance, the hazard due to earthquakes that won't happen on faults, as opposed to orange here, which shows the hazard due to earthquakes on faults. And obviously, depending on where cities or locations are with respect to nearby active faults, the relative importance of earthquakes on faults will fluctuate. And so here's an example where in Lilongwe, for instance, the role of earthquakes on faults is relatively small compared to so-called background earthquakes, while in Blantyre and Mzuzu, you can see that the proximity to active faults is important and drives up the hazard. So here are some of our maps for the peak ground acceleration that we estimated for Malawi. On the left here is a figure that shows the peak ground acceleration expected to be exceeded in 50 years with a 10% probability due to only earthquakes in the background. So this would be close to what GEM has estimated. And on the right here, you see the contribution that the active faults will make in our estimation because of the possible occurrence of large earthquakes on these faults. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the combination. And what you'll see is that the hazard becomes much more variable in space as a result of proximity to active faults. And down here is the same calculation for a higher sort of exceedance, lower probability of exceedance in 50 years. And you see that the hazard increases quite significantly, especially close to high slip rate faults. Here are some more comparisons that we've made with respect to GEMS, Poggi et al. 2017 study. And as I've already mentioned, these differences are largely due to the faults that we've included. And overall, we have a slightly higher moment release in Malawi due to the occurrence of large earthquakes that happen at very long recurrence intervals. It's also perhaps interesting to point out that there was a previous fault-based PSHA study conducted in Malawi by Michael Hodge and others in 2015. And at the time, the best estimate of active faults is represented in this figure here, showing sort of a handful of faults. And you can really see the improvement in the resolution of the active fault database here in this figure, which is really the tremendous work of people involved in the Prepare and Safer Prepare project that has led to significant differences in the seismic hazard estimates. And as I mentioned, perhaps in the interest of time, I won't go through this in detail, but as I've mentioned, we're also conducting analysis of the suitability of existing ground motion models for Malawi. This is work led by Werner Holmgren, who's been collecting all the available seismic records in the East African Rift in order to understand how good the existing global ground motion models work in this context. And we have, I think, some hope that we can come to at least some initial statements about their suitability. So here are some very early results comparing some global ground motion models against the seismic records that she's collected. So let me try and summarize the contributions from our work package 2. In pictures here, we've gone from the active fault database to the seismogenic source database, which contains information about the magnitudes and frequencies of earthquakes on these faults. And from there, we've moved on to estimating the seismic hazard in the region using a workflow that includes epistemic uncertainty in the choices for how we represent future earthquake hazard. So in conclusion, we believe that the instrumental record of earthquakes in Malawi is probably too short to establish the long-term seismic hazard. Geological fault data and geodetic data can help address this limitation to some extent. We've produced a new fault-based probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, and this implies higher seismic hazard levels, especially close to active faults. Now, damaging earthquakes may still occur away from the mapped active faults, which we reflect in our PSHA by background seismicity. And finally, we need to validate the global ground motion models that we're currently using in the regional context. And perhaps, if we have enough data, modify these to account for Malawi's relatively unusual thick seismogenic crust. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.